Welcome to the NatRefs Show, a weekly podcast on the ever-changing world of natural refrigerants, brought to you by Shecco with support from component maker Teco. Today, we will be discussing the major news items impacting the world of natural refrigerants. My name is Michael Garry, editor of Shecco's Accelerate America magazine and North American editor for Shecco, and I will be hosting today's podcast from Shecco's New York area bureau outside of New York City. I'm joined today by three of my colleagues in our main Brussels, Belgium office, Charlotte McLaughlin, and later you'll hear from Marie Battesti and Andrew Williams. So hello, Charlotte.
Hi, Michael.
Good to be with you. On today's agenda, we will be discussing the shortage of CO2 gas and how that has affected the HVAC and R business. And two very interesting developments coming out of the United States. One, the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to be a justice on the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh being the judge who ruled in the important HFC's case. And then, of course, the impact of the brewing China-U.S. trade war precipitated by the Trump administration. Finally, we'll hear from Marie and Andrew about the Montreal Protocol meeting taking place in Vienna. So over to Charlotte now to talk about CO2 shortage.
Okay, so this story has been going on for quite a while now. In mid-June, the 19th of June, Gasworld broke the news that there's been a raw CO2 supply crisis throughout Europe, particularly affecting the UK, where a lot of people have been sort of outraged by the fact that that beer deliveries have been impacted, especially during the World Cup period. I think if anybody's been paying attention to the news, that's really what the main newspapers have talked about. But the HVAC and R sector has not really experienced great such shutdowns. So CO2 it's sort of like a byproduct from ammonia production. And then this byproduct is then purchased, this raw CO2, by gas suppliers throughout Europe, who then refine it into different uses for CO2. So CO2 as a refrigerant is refined into the refrigerant, but so far this has not had some big impacts. So we asked a Scottish manufacturer of CO2 package systems, Star Refrigeration, if they've had any problems, and they basically said we've had no issues so far, and this was also confirmed by one of the leading suppliers of CO2 units, and also somebody who services these CO2 units as well in the UK, Green Cooling, who told us that we are having no issues at the present. There has been a price increase, a slight anecdotal price increase according to Star Refrigeration, and also another HVAC and R news outlet in the UK, Rack Plus, did say that there has been some panic buying by people who purchase CO2 as a refrigerant. So there's been some issues, but it hasn't been drastic, basically.
And they're addressing this shortage, right? The ammonia plants that were affected are addressing what issues they had, so that the CO2 production should go back up, right?
Yeah, definitely. So the situation seems to be back on track. A lot of these European plants have come back online. We spoke to a gas supplier, one of the people who refine CO2, and they told us in a statement that the situation is evolving, but overall raw CO2 plants are on a restarting mode, so they should have progressively more CO2 in the next few days. They told us this on 10th of July, so it's already been some days later, and so it should be okay, but there has been some concern by the food industry in the UK, by the Meat Association, and then also by the Food and Drink Federation, that this taking it so long to refine the CO2 may have some impact for food and drink products, basically. But no one from the refrigeration industry has so far told us that they've had any serious issues. So good news for at least HVAC and R.
Yeah, it's interesting that CO2 production would be affected in this way. Of course, it didn't happen. It didn't affect the U.S. or North American market, which of course has its own suppliers. So, but it's certainly something for everybody using CO2 as a refrigerant to be aware of. So, getting to the developments in the U.S. So I'll start with the story that you did on the U.S.-China trade war. We got interesting feedback from Francis Dietz, the VP of Public Affairs at the AHRI, Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute, on the impact of these latest round of U.S. tariffs, which covered Chinese air conditioners, heat pumps, and refrigerators, among other things, including even anhydrous ammonia. And these tariffs are seen as disruptive by AHRI, disruptive to the business cycles of our members, to the global supply chain and negotiations on treaties like NAFTA, is what Mr. Dietz told us. And also, importantly, many of these tariffs, he said, have forced our members to raise prices to cover the increased cost of raw materials, which is unfortunate. He concluded with saying, our industry remains strong, but the longer this persists, the more negative the effects. So really, of course, the Trump trade initiatives have come under, I think, a lot of criticism in the U.S. even from Republicans and from senators and congressmen in states with a lot of farmers who have been negatively impacted. So it's really a kind of rolling crisis, you may say, this whole tariff business, and it's even got to the point where it's affecting prices in the HVAC and R business, which, of course, will hurt consumers and potentially hurt sales of products and so on. So that's one development we'll be watching going forward. The other one is the interesting nomination of Brett Kavanaugh by President Trump to replace Anthony Kennedy, who's retiring on the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in the land, which has huge impact on society and U.S. society. So the interesting thing to us, of course, is that Kavanaugh was part of a 3-judge panel in the U.S. Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit that ruled 2-1 in the Mexichem versus EPA case, that the EPA cannot require companies to replace HFCs that were used as an alternative to the R22s of the world. Can't replace those once they're installed. And the replacements, of course, would be by things like natural refrigerants. But in any case, they're saying EPA cannot require companies to replace HFCs once they've been used, as an alternative to the ozone depleting substances. This was a huge case for this industry, as everybody probably knows, it's really created a lot of uncertainty in the business, and there are a whole series of activities going on now to address that by the EPA, by California, by the Kigali Amendment figures into this. So it's interesting that this guy, of all people, is the guy who has been named. Of course, he still has to be confirmed by the Senate, and the environmental organizations will be opposing his nomination, among many other individuals on other issues. So it's not 100% that he'll be.
How likely do you think it will be that he will be confirmed? Like, do you see any dissent from some of the Republicans? Do they have enough votes basically to make sure that he is nominated?
It's really that's the big question, and I wish I knew the answer, but I don't, and really nobody does. I'd say the chances are likely that he'll be confirmed, simply because Republicans are in control, be it by only one, basically, well, by a 51 to 49 majority. One of their senators, Senator McCain, is ill and probably won't be involved. So it's really just a 50 to 49 majority, a one-vote majority. So all that's needed is for all the Democrats to oppose the nomination, and that's not necessarily certain. And then they'd also need one Republican, possibly one of the two women who are opposed to, who are pro-choice on the abortion issue, Collins of Maine, Murkowski of Alaska. But it's really unclear what they'll end up doing. If I were a betting man, I'd say he'll be confirmed, but it's going to be against fierce oppositions from many different groups. It's not going to be a walk in the park.
Is there any more environmental cases where he's ruled against the environmental option?
Right, that's a good question. There are, in fact. He's been involved in other EPA rulings. He typically takes a conservative stand. And in fact, the E&E News described Kavanaugh, as one of the most powerful critics of the Obama administration's environmental rules, which of course, fits well with the Trump administration. His track record over the last few years makes him more open to second guessing the EPA than nearly anyone else, according to the Constitutional Accountability Center. In particular, he has written about the Clean Power Plan. He argued that the urgency, that the sweeping climate rule behind the Clean Power Plan should be subject to a stricter degree of scrutiny. He said that global warming is not a blank check, so that he said the urgency of climate change does not authorize the EPA to, quote, exceed its authority. So that he's very, as he was with the Mexichem case, he's a real stickler for the EPA to follow in a very narrow way its statutory authority, and not do something that is a logical outgrowth of that authority, but not maybe specifically spelled out in the statute. So he's just that kind of judge. He also is somebody who in 2014, in another case, he ruled that the EPA has to take into account the costs of its regulations. They have to review both the benefit and the costs, and he is critical of the EPA for not taking costs into consideration sufficiently. And so he's definitely a guy who's quite conservative. In the Mexichem case, he said, for example, he says, however much we might sympathize or agree with the EPA's policy objectives, EPA may act only within the boundaries of its statutory authority. And he says, and he took particular issue with the use of the word replace. The EPA wanted to replace HFCs that already replaced CFCs, and Kavanaugh believes you can only replace something once. Once you replace it, that's it. You're done. If you need a different statute or different authority to replace it again. this is, debatable conclusion. A lot of people pointed out it does not really align with the intent of the law, but that's what he said. And his decision really has wreaked havoc with the industry, and sort of set back the cause of the HFC phase down in the United States. But the last word has not been said on this. Hopefully, we'll get some clarity in the not too distant future. All right. We'll now hear from Andrew and Marie on the latest Montreal Protocol meeting that took place in Vienna.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, I'm here with Marie, who's just come back from an important Montreal Protocol meeting in Vienna last week. Marie, maybe you can explain in a bit more detail what the meeting was all about.
Yes, so it's called the Open-Ended Working Group. It's organized every year, and it is basically the parties to the Montreal Protocol who gather half year through to assess the challenges as well as the achievements of the implementation of the Montreal Protocol. So this year, of course, the implementation of the Kigali Amendment and the OEWG, this conference is called. Basically, they decide which item will be put on the agenda for decision making for the meeting of the parties, which is coming in autumn usually. So this year is going to be next November in Ecuador, Quito.
Okay, and so this particular meeting in Vienna was held from the 11th to the 14th of July, meaning that the build-up to the event was dominated by the release of a report at the beginning of the week from the Environmental Investigation Agency, providing evidence that CFC-11, an ozone-depleting chemical banned in 2010, is still continuing to be used by 18 different companies in China. I assume that was overshadowing the event in Vienna.
Yeah, it was the main topic of discussion, both in the plenary as well as in the corridors. The Technical Economic Assessment Panel, which is a group of experts working for the Montreal Protocol in charge of scientific assessment and economic assessment, were meeting since last Sunday in order to decide if it should be put on the meeting of the parties' agenda in November then, and really if a strong policy, if a policy decision should be taken about that. The problem, so the main point, and because this Technical Economic Assessment Panel did a presentation on stage during the plenary on Thursday, if I recall, their conclusion are a bit vague so far. Basically, they're saying that they cannot confirm there's illegal production from a particular place because it's apparently impossible from the atmosphere, if I can say, to see where a source of emission is emitted. They also cannot confirm if there's actual production. It could be just a release of the substance that was made before it was banned and all of a sudden being released, or through leaks all over the world, because take into account that according to scientists and specialists of the atmosphere, you just cannot put the finger on China from the atmosphere to say that there's a problem there of illegal release of those toxic gases.
Okay, and do we know how the EIA has responded to that? Because obviously this is quite a lengthy piece of research that they've done. Some of the words from the EIA upon releasing the report were pretty strong, talking of environmental crime on a massive scale, talking that steps need to be taken to ensure enforcement and compliance with all the obligations of the Montreal Protocol. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's too early to say that they've kind of brushing this under the carpet or kicking it into the long grass, so to speak, but this sounds like the type of response that we saw in Vienna is not going to be what the EIA is
indeed,
expecting.
And it's much more complicated than that, because I feel like, so the Technical Economic Assessment Panel is saying we cannot say there's actual production, we cannot say it comes from China in particular, but we can confirm there is increased emissions in the atmosphere. So already it's a first step. So I feel like at least on short term, the EIA response was more awareness raising and still insisting on the need. And even the parties to the Montreal Protocol were all making statements during the plenary that this was an issue, a very serious issue, and the technical economic assessment panel should further research, insist, because it's jeopardizing also the credibility of the Montreal Protocol. And like, for example, Japan representatives said that they were the second biggest contributor to the multilateral fund. And if there's no respect of the mob, they don't see why they should still contribute. So they warned that they might freeze their contribution. So I feel like the scientists, they have a scientific way of seeing the issue, so they are always in doubt and they push for further investigation basically, but they don't go as fast as NGOs or some parties which are maybe a bit more political, so they are more cautious. So indeed there was nothing really concrete, but it is on the agenda thanks to the push and the pressure of those stakeholders. And basically, they announced that a team of 60 scientists will review this report from the Technical Economic Assessment Panel in Geneva and write the executive summary of the final report, which will be presented at the next meeting of the parties, so in Ecuador in November, as I said, with hopefully more conclusive results and policy action. So this policy action is driven by the action of those stakeholders, of the parties, the one who invest in the multilateral fund, as well as those NGOs such as the Environmental Investigation Agency. So hopefully, thanks to this pressure, more conclusive actions will be taken. And the advantage, I feel, of the TEAP, so it's the Technical Economic Assessment Panel, is that they are working for the Montreal Protocol, but they are scientists. So we can expect, there's going to be policy recommendations on top of this scientific assessment. So it should be interesting.
Okay, so a desire to act once the situation becomes clearer, basically.
Yeah, it would be a bit... it would be too fast right now to take a policy action, basically, based on those conclusions I said, that they are still, apparently, they are still unsure regarding the source of production.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marie. That's very interesting to hear the latest updates about the China factories situation. Moving on now to another important event that was held in Vienna around the Montreal Protocol meeting, focusing more specifically on HVAC&R and the energy efficiency of HVAC&R systems.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, this meeting, OEWG, took place between Wednesday and Saturday of the week. And 2 days before, there was a so-called energy efficiency while phasing down hydrofluorocarbons workshop, which belongs to the Montreal Protocol. It was organized by UNEP, the United Nations Environmental... by UNEP. So basically, the topic was how can we improve energy efficiency while phasing down HFCs? And some parties were very disappointed and said it during the plenary because they invited various stakeholders from the private sector. We had Midea on stage, we had the Belgian supermarket chain Deleuze, as well as scientists or NGO representatives talking about their experience, basically going throughout the supply chain to show some positive examples, issue recommendations on this topic. And a lot of parties, including, for example, Saudi Arabia, complained that some stakeholders were more focusing on the energy efficiency side and forgetting the phase down, meaning they were insisting a lot on leak checking, refrigerant management, end of life, and everything, saying that they could save up to 30% of energy by properly training your technicians. And they were saying, but if we only listen to your recommendations, basically we could have done the same with the CFCs 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there's an HFC phase down. We want to know what are the technical properties of different refrigerants who could who are alternatives to HFCs in order to implement the Kigali Amendment. And I felt like it was a big complaint among mostly developing countries, Article 5 countries as it's called under the Montreal Protocol, in Africa, for example, or Philippines. Philippines raised a lot their curiosity regarding the properties of R290 and ammonia, and if they fit with energy efficiency, these energy efficiency requirements. So it was it's like there's a lot of potential, especially for the natural refrigerants community.
I was going to say, so was there any recognition of the role that natural refrigerants in particular can play in this?
Well, I felt like the recognition was more told during side events. So it's like events organized by private parties, NGOs, or industry throughout the meeting, as well as through the delegates who were raising their hand to ask questions. But on stage, I felt like it was, honestly, this leak checking and training was dominating the debates, And and the parties highlighted it as well. They were like, I heard more about proper alternatives with their energy efficiency potential during side events or talking to the industries rather than in here, which is supposed to be the fora to learn everything they have to know for their national roadmaps, Mm-hmm. So I felt like it was very exciting from a natural refrigerants perspective to see parties as well as different stakeholders raising their hand and trying to push the natural refrigerant agenda as much as they can. So I feel like there's really a growing interest and an awareness about the benefits and the qualities of R290 regarding energy efficiency. For example, CO2 or ammonia, they all have really excellent properties. And those private stakeholders raised it much more, I felt, than the official ozone representatives on stage.
Okay, but I believe that the conclusions of the workshop were then forwarded on to the parties to the Montreal Protocol attending the OEWG, right?
Yes. And of course, like those side events or questions being raised, I don't know if they are that much taken into account. Although, for example, the TIP I was talking about, which is really the intelligence arm of the Montreal Protocol, recognized on stage that it is possible that R290 is going to be the refrigerant of choice for small applications, and they don't see any problem of supply, for example. So NatRefs are being more and more on the stage, and I don't know, I feel like probably it's this Kigali Amendment really being concrete now and real. So parties are pushing like, okay, enough of blah blah, now we have to comply. So maybe that's this, but I feel like this year it moved a little bit more. So I'm looking forward to see the meeting of the parties in November, because we are gaining more and more space, I feel.
Okay, thank you, Marie. I'm sure we haven't heard the last of this story. It will indeed be interesting to hear what's happening in terms of raising awareness of natural refrigerants at these Montreal Protocol meetings going forward. Michael, back to you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Marie and Andrew. Well, that wraps up today's NatRefs show. I want to thank my colleagues, Charlotte, Andrew, and Marie. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next week on the NatRefs show.